Well, I'll speak about this question on the basis of what I've heard from my own lamas and their teachings from the traditional Indian and Tibetan Buddhist texts that are inherited by our schools. So, first of all, there's a tricky point around the notion of calling Buddhism philosophy, but it's equally tricky to call it a religion, because these are in a way Western formulations and don't really apply in the Buddhist context. Buddhism is a way system aiming at liberation, at freedom from, well, the sufferings inherent in existence, in samsara, as we call it, this cycle of suffering, cycle of rebirth. But that liberation isn't going to be found as a religious person or a theist-like thing by being delivered by God or a savior figure. Neither is the world itself created by any kind of external being, any superior being. So Buddhism is, in one way, resolutely non-theistic, yet, unlike contemporary non-religious philosophy in the West, which is materialist, Buddhism is not materialist. It sees that there's something in human beings, in fact in all sentient beings, which transcends the merely material. So to go back to the starting point, Buddhism is a philosophy that aims at liberation. And that makes it quite different from what we're used to in philosophy in the West, which is kind of, if you like, the formulation of logical theories about the world, but which don't really have any aim beyond merely improving the sharpness of our theories and our use of language. Now, to open it out a little bit more, if we contrast the Buddhist view, the view founded by the Buddha and then transmitted by his successors in the various Buddhist cultures, we can do this. We can say, what makes Buddhism different from what we're used to is that we would say that religions and philosophies fall into two distinct camps, both of which Buddhism sees as deficient in their understanding of the world, in their analysis of reality. Those two camps are, to put it very simply, the camp of those thinkers in various cultures, in various places, at various times, who have argued that, in fact, there is something more than the material in life, in the world. It's the domain of the spirit, or whatever one wants to term it. And this is usually associated with a God who is the supreme spirit, a supreme spiritual being, creator of all other spiritual beings. And God himself, herself, itself, whatever, the supreme being, is eternal and the creator of all other beings, who, once created by him or her or it, also will exist forever. So these theories, whether it's found in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, various types of Hinduism, and many other systems beyond that, we say eternalists, because they propose that there are entities that endure, once created, endure forever, unchanging. They have an essence which never changes. They may be moving from body to body, or in Christian sense, going from this life in this world to life after death in purgatory, hell, or heaven, or wherever. But there's some unchanging, unique identity about these entities. So the Christian term, of course, is usually for this is soul. Well, Buddhism does not find such enduring entities, because for Buddhism, the characteristic of all phenomena that come into being is that precisely because they do come into being, in dependence upon cause and conditions, they're impermanent. As it's said in the famous Four Seals, signifying Buddhist teaching, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. And human beings, human minds, human emotions, canine minds, elephant minds, elephant bodies, human bodies, all conditioned, galaxies, cosmoses, all of this is forever changing, arising and passing away, arising and disintegrating from moment to moment. There may seem to be some kind of continuity, but it's only the continuity of the entity rapidly changing until it disintegrates entirely into an utterly distinct set of conditions. So we reject the idea of an eternal soul, an eternal self, or an eternal God. But on the other hand, the opposing system of thought to that, which is evident in philosophy like materialism, is really that there is no continuity whatsoever, that phenomena arise, of course, but they arise without consequence. So there are no past and future lives, because the human being is a merely material organism. All sentient beings, in fact, truly do not have sentience, do not have consciousness. So this set of views, which was prevalent in the ancient world, in Greece, in India, alongside spiritual philosophies, and is prevalent in the modern world, we would categorize in Buddhist terms as annihilationism, the counter to eternalism. Annihilationism, which says the fate of all entities is simply to arise and disappear without consciousness, without consequence. So there can be no past and future lives, and also no consequence of our actions now. So those are the two dominant streams in thinking. They're in a way like the mirror image of each other, because each of them really take very seriously the notion that there are truly existent phenomena. It's just that one camp says some of these phenomena endure forever, and the other camp says they arise and perish momentarily without any outcome, without any consequence. And you can see how in European philosophy there's been a swing, Western philosophy, Western thought, there's been swings between these two opposed systems. But Buddhism rejects both of them. It's not that Buddha pitched his camp, so to speak, philosophically speaking, between the two, like taking half from one side, half from the other. It's actually really that Buddha considered both of these opinions equally deficient, equally, so to speak, missing the point about the nature of reality, which is that, in fact, there is continuity and change. Both of these are woven into the very nature of reality, because all that arises through the dependent interaction of causes and conditions. Those causing conditions at any given moment are just momentary appearances, but in their interaction, they create the next set of momentary appearances. So there is causation. The phenomena of one moment appear to give rise to the phenomena of the next moment. So there's no need to posit an unchanging identity in any of this. Not one of those causing conditions is permanent, endures forever. If it did, it could not interact with anything else. It would have a solitary, unassisted nature, and therefore could not give rise to anything. But precisely because all those phenomena are contingent, are dependently arising themselves, then further phenomena can arise. Whether those further phenomena are the experience of the next moment, or the next day, or the next life. Whether those contingently arising phenomena are the phenomena of nature, the elements, the trees, the grasses, the waters, the earth, and so on, or whether it's the emotions and perceptions and thoughts of sentient beings. All of these are dependently arising. So, like I say, there is continuity. The thoughts and decisions of this moment give rise to actions which influence and shape the future moment, just like the chemical interactions in this moment shape the compound that will arise through those chemical interactions. So the nihilists have got it utterly wrong to claim there are existent phenomena which just arise and cease without consequence, imagining that there's no future lives and no past lives. But the eternalists have got it wrong because they posit these unchanging entities, who, as I said, could not be the source of anything because existing separate and in themselves, they could not interact because it's only phenomena which are mutable, which do not possess inherent identity, which do not possess intrinsic nature, that can interact and be the basis of further phenomena. So for Buddha, the crucial point is this one: all phenomena are dependently arising. Hence, philosophies which posit selves, real unchanging identities, whether it be the spiritual self, signified by Christian terms like soul, the soul that will created by God will then go to heaven or go to hell or purgatory, or whether it's the materialist idea of himself just as kind of brain substances which arise and cease, and the identity being entirely no more than that. Both of those versions of the self are actually completely incoherent, inconsistent with experience and reality. So therefore Buddha termed his view the middle way. Not the middle way as it's kind of hinting earlier, because it's a mixture of both. A mixture of both sides of this, the eternalist and annihilationist side, would be simply a rather stupid compound of double mistake, double error. You don't arrive at truth by compounding error, adding together two erroneous positions and thinking that somehow when added together they'll make the truth. No, Buddha's view is the middle way because it transcends those extremes. Those two positions, the eternalist position and the annihilationist position, cut off view literally in Sanskrit, Uchedavada, are deviations from reality. It's like when we adopt those views, we've kind of fallen into a ditch at the side of the road. We've deviated from the clear view of reality. In fact, what we've done is we've taken a feature of the nature of things, on one side, continuity, that causes and conditions do give rise to effects, and exaggerated it until that partial truth becomes an outright distortion. Similarly with the annihilationists, they've taken impermanence, the fact that cause and conditions are forever changing, and made it into an absolute, that there is no consequence of cause and conditions, hence no future lives. So that is why we say in Dharma, these two views are extremist views, as we call them. Extremist not in the sense of kind of dreary political extremism, but extremist in the sense that exaggerate a feature of phenomena, and by exaggerating that feature, they turn it into an untruth. They turn it into an error. So Buddha's view is the middle way in that. Again, another way to signify just how radical this view is that it, through this analysis of how phenomena arise, it actually cuts through, sees through, dissolves that identity to which we cling so dearly, the identity of being a real me, a real I, a real self, the one who is unchanging, the controller, the one who is permanent, independent, unitary. That idea of self is present, actually, whether articulated philosophically or not, in all of us except those who've seen the truth, those who have become Buddhas as we would see it. Because the belief in self is not just an opinion, it's an emotion. Animals too have it. That's why they seek to defend themselves against others and advance their own interests and appetites over others. Everybody with mind harbors this delusion of selfhood, of intrinsic I-ness, of intrinsic identity. And it is the cause of all our suffering. And this is why Buddhism becomes a liberative philosophy. This thinking clearly about the nature of reality, of what is the nature of phenomena, what is the nature of this body and mind, this being, leads us to untangle the roots of our suffering. Because it is through clinging to this idea of me against the world, me a permanent, self-existent self, that I set myself against others. I see others either as enemies to be conquered because they threaten my sense of security, or I see others in the world as objects to be plundered, to build up my sense of security by possession, by gaining more territory, more objects which make me feel secure. In short, my clinging to self is the root of where these poisonous emotions of desire and hatred, associated with ignorance, of course, comes from that. So, and those disturbing emotions then prompt my actions in the world. Actions done in the hope that I can gain security and happiness and permanence and so on for myself, but never actually succeeding. And therefore, I collide again and again with reality. That collision with reality, which can't be bent and shaped to my ego's wishes, because my ego, myself, is finally fictional, is where suffering comes from. The suffering which Buddha characterized as inherent to samsara. But this samsara, where suffering is inherent, is my own fabrication from day to day, from moment to moment, from life to life. So what will bring this to an end is clear seeing, the clear seeing articulated by Buddha in his teaching, which one might call the Buddha's philosophy. So to situate the Dharma, initially one should put it in this way. It is the middle way which transcends the true extreme theories of eternalism and annihilationism. I think that will situate the Buddha's teaching nicely to begin with. Now, Buddha shared this teaching arising from his own experience of the nature of reality, his awakening as we call it, with his followers. He presented it in many different ways according to their aptitudes and backgrounds. Obviously, the people who came to Buddha 500 years ago in India were coming from North Indian culture, which meant they'd been influenced by various systems. Some were from the Brahmanical system, with the Vedic religion, the Vedic culture, the Vedic system of gods and offerings and so on. And some came from a more intellectually adventurous background, people looking at different non-Vedic philosophical and religious practices. So Buddha's teaching varied in a way. The message is always the same, the need to liberate oneself from the fiction of self, but the way this was couched, in what kind of language and so on, would vary. Because Buddha often would usually work with the starting assumptions of his questioners and get them to look into their own assumptions, their own prejudices, and kind of gradually dismantle them by looking for the truth and of their prejudices, of their assumptions. So that's why Buddhist philosophy, if we're going to use that word, is extremely rich from the beginning, because of the need to present the teachings according to the where the audience were coming from. So if we consider that the kind of primary source of the Buddhist teaching, the Buddhist philosophy, is in Buddha's words found in the sutras, the discourses, there's already an enormous amount of material there, an enormous amount of rich material to allow people to, as it were, unthink, to deconstruct their thinking and replace conceptual addiction by clear seeing into the heart of reality. So Buddhist philosophy, again, to use that term, although I'm questioning it, is a kind of deconstructive enterprise, really. It's not about piling up theories on the world or stating creedal opinions which one has to assent to. It's really and aided by meditation, of course, looking into and unpicking the knot in our perception, in our thinking. But it's enormously rich because there's so many tools for this process as I've described it, unpicking. Now that richness then resulted in the centuries after Buddha in various Buddhist thinkers, Buddhist masters, in India primarily to begin with, sorting through the range of teachings in the discourses and sutras, particularly those precisely concerned with these questions of what is true, what is real, what is the nature of things, what is the nature of phenomena, and formulating, as it were, what they would consider to be the definitive philosophical teachings, what is called in Sanskrit siddhanta, or in Tibetan drupta, the limit of accomplishment. We would probably translate this term siddhanta as philosophical school in English, but actually possibly better is the translated as a system of tenets, views about the world, and system meaning systematically organized. So that means, to cut a long story somewhat short, that over the next 1,000 or so years following Lord Buddha's passing in India, 4 major systems of tenets developed among Buddha's followers. Now, of course, just to make it really clear, one doesn't mean all Buddhists in India or Buddhists in Asia subsequently, or Buddhists now are all philosophically articulate, are all versed in the philosophical systems, the tenet systems. That's not true. The majority of Buddhist practitioners historically and culture now are actually concerned primarily with, and for good reason, with practicing the teachings on virtue that leads to happiness for oneself and others, and trying the basis for future happiness in future lives and so on. It's a dedicated minority who are interested with these profound questions, which of course are part and parcel of the profound path to liberation. So just to make that clear. But nevertheless, to describe, as it were, the history of Buddhist philosophy as in terms of these 4 tenet systems makes a lot of sense. Except one thing one must make clear. If one was kind of trying to describe Buddhist philosophy, and you can see I'm still putting that word in inverted commas, in terms that make sense, like in a kind of comparative philosophy seminar or something like that, on the model of a history of ideas in the West, then you would be thinking, oh, each generation gets better and better, wiser and wiser. The philosophy gets more and more, unless you're Heidegger. So you wouldn't think that case about most Western philosophy. I think it's probably gone quite wrong. But and we should get back to the pre-Socratics. But anyway, my point is, the Buddhist, we think as Buddhists, followers of the Buddha, they cannot improve on the Buddha's enlightenment. He stripped away all fiction in his thinking and saw reality clearly. So it's not something that some later Johnny can come along and improve on. Enlightenment is enlightenment. Of course, that's a faith position in a way, but it's one that can be tested by reasoning and your analysis aided by meditation. So just we need to be clear about that as followers of the Buddha. The Buddhist tenet systems don't improve upon the teachings of Buddha himself. But they help us to understand, they clarify. Does that mean they all actually have the same understanding of Buddhist teaching? No, they don't. And that is why we will say, one could say right at the outset, that for us, and that means followers of the Tibetan schools, and I think to some extent followers of other Mahayana Buddhisms in other countries, it's the Madhyamaka, the so-called Madhyamaka or middle way system of tenets, which presents the clearest, the most worked out presentation of Buddha's philosophical of Buddha's philosophical teachings. But they do so on the basis of what Buddha himself taught in certain discourses. So let me just run through the tenet systems. It may be useful to do so. And there is an order, historical order, or there's something of a historical order to them. So the earliest of the four tenet systems was called Vaibhashika. It's because of the name of their basic manual, the Vaibhasha. And this arose around about first century of the Christian era, so maybe 300, 400 years after the Buddha's passing. And this system of thought emphasized very much the teaching of impermanence, but it understood that the Buddhist teaching signified that while all phenomena, mental and physical, are momentary and therefore lack permanence, they do exist in that very moment. They have a kind of momentary existence. They are, as it were, so in terms of the physical world, the Vaibhashikas argued that what impermanence means is that while perceptible objects are themselves just agglomerations of atoms, to use the Western word, those atoms do exist in themselves in their moment of arising. So they endure momentarily and then cease. So the physical world is made of real phenomena, although they're just momentary atoms coming together through the binding force of energy and the karma of sentient beings. Likewise, the Vaibhashikas argued that when it comes to the mind, yes, the mind is impermanent, but in any given moment of mental experience, there is something real. The moment, the consciousness itself, and the associated mental factors shaping that consciousness. So, in short, there are real phenomena. The five aggregates, the five skandhas in Sanskrit, which all conditioned phenomena can be agglomerated into. The five skandhas, though momentary, and though lacking a self in the sense of a permanent owner of those skandhas, those aggregates, a soul or anything like that, the very stuff of things, atoms and moments of consciousness, are real, albeit momentary. And also, they're two separate categories of being. The material, atoms, the consciousness, the moments of perception and so on, they are separate. One does not arise from the other. So the view of the Vaibhashikas is one might say, again to use Western terms, atomist. The world is made of atoms, albeit momentary, and dualist. So for that, and so they supported that view by the emphasizing the teachings that Buddha has given about the kind of impermanence of the skandhas, that as I mentioned, the aggregates. The Vaibhashika school is accompanied, in a way, by a second early school of philosophy. It's a tenet system called Sautrantrika. Sautrantrika seems to be just a little bit later in terms of its appearance. It's almost like an offshoot of the Vaibhashika. Again, I'm simplifying enormously in these descriptions, but the distinction between the two is not in terms of their ethics. I should have mentioned that before, but of course the Vaibhashikas are followers of the Shravaka or Hinayana system. For them, individual freedom is the summum bonum, the highest goal, personal nirvana. They lack the Mahayana imperative for universal altruism. The Sautrantikas are similar in their understanding of the purpose of the Buddhist path. But the Sautrantikas refine, to a certain extent, the dualism of the Vaibhashikas. Because dualism is, of course, an extremely difficult view of the world to defend, to argue that somehow reality is chopped up into two distinct halves and somehow they interact. So the Sautrantikas' take was to say that, yes, there is still a dualism, there's still atoms which are real and which are, in a way, the objects that are perceived by perceiving consciousness and then shaped into objects that we take as tables and bodies and all the rest of it. But that in any given moment of perception, what is appearing in the mind is actually an image rather than the direct, naked object itself. Because for the Vaibhashika, for the Sautrantikas, there can't really be the perceiving consciousness existing in the same moment as something of an entirely different category, an insentient object out there. So perception is always, in a way, mentally based. Experience is always mentally based for the Sautrantikas. It's like there was an object in the preceding moment, and that then triggers off an image in the mind. But the object and the perceiving consciousness cannot exist at the very same moment for the Sautrantikas. So it's a refinement in terms of explaining how perception works, and goes some way, but not all the way, to kind of softening this very dualistic understanding of the Vaibhashikas. There's lots more that one could say about the Vaibhashikas themselves and about the Sautrantikas. But what I'm trying to do here is, in a way, explain how the teaching of emptiness and non-self is interpreted by each of the schools, each of the four Tenet systems, and to imply that it gets that the Vaibhashika's understanding of emptiness is confined to simply there is no me, no I. What there is instead is the five skandhas, which are my body, which is itself just atoms, arising and passing away from moment to moment, and this consciousness and its associated mental factors. For them, that is emptiness, that is non-self. The Sautrantikas then make that somewhat more sophisticated, but we're still basically dealing with the same model that non-self is the abolition only of the personal identity. Of course, grasping at the personal identity is the root of our individual suffering, but their understanding doesn't really go further. Where the understanding goes further is in the Chittamatra school of tenets, the first of the two Mahayana schools. The Chittamatra, mind only, and Madhyamaka, middle way, they're Mahayana schools of tenets. That means ethically they share the common Mahayana imperative of the Bodhisattva vow, that generation of bodhicittas, it's called, the impulse to achieve Buddhahood, not merely for oneself, but for others, which is consistent, of course, with the example of the Buddha himself, which he taught in his discourses on the Mahayana, his Mahayana sutras, as we would say, those with that kind of, as it were, an affinity with that more universalist approach to Dharma practice, embodied in the Mahayana. But the Chittamatra and Madhyamaka schools are not only distinct from the Hinayana schools, such as Vaibhashika and Sautrantrika, in terms of ethics and understanding of the goal of the path, but in their view of reality. And once again, it comes back to what is the significance of Buddha's teaching on non-self and emptiness? Just what is that referring to? And for both of them, the answer will be, it's not merely the personal self, not merely that I-ness. It's in fact the notion that any phenomena whatsoever possess any of the characteristics of intrinsic nature, of inherent existence, or in short, possess a self. So it's a universal non-self, which the Mahayana and therefore these two schools emphasize. But how they emphasize it, how they arrive at it, is somewhat different. The Chittamatra school, as I said, it means in Sanskrit the term Chittamatra means mind only, and therefore the Tibetan term is samsampa. I mean, there are, and again, I'm simplifying because there are different, slightly different trends within Mahayana, within Chittamatra. Different masters emphasize slightly different takes on it. But to simplify, one could say that the Chittamatra argues, as its name implies, that actually the basis of all phenomena is none other than mind itself. That nothing goes beyond the mind. All phenomena are objects of mental experience. That the idea that there is a world of real objects, real physical hard objects out there, separate, finally cannot be sustained. Everything is in fact a facet of mental experience, according to the Chittamatrians. And the notion that there are separate objects out there is bound up with our need to affirm, once again, the idea of personal identity, the self which cannot exist unless it is the subject, the one who owns, who perceives objects out there and external to it. In other words, my reality, in a way, seems to be dependent upon the notion of others, other phenomena's reality. Unless there are real things out there I'm perceiving, who am I? What is my identity? And the Chittamatras argue that in fact, you're not, in any given moment of experience, it is simply the play of mind. That we then, as it were, retrospectively, and that retrospection is going on from moment to moment as like a kind of commentary on our experience, we introject into that, we interpolate into that, we project onto that flow of unitary experience the notion of I. I'm the perceiver. I'm perceiving those objects. When in fact, if we were to look at it dispassionately, we would see there is simply the flow of experience. And that is what is meant by mind only. That the subject and object I'm later projecting onto and then filtering my experience through that dualistic framework, which is actually fictional, which actually is not really there. No more than in the experience during dream time, when various appearances arise to me, beautiful or frightening or mundane or whatever it is, which I truly believe at the time these appearances are external things, that they will give me fear or give me delight or whatever. But on waking, I realize that there is nothing other than just mental experience, just a flow of mental energy taking these different shapes and prompting in me different emotional responses. When I awake, where have the dream images fled to? They've not gone to anywhere. Where did they come from? They didn't come from anywhere. They didn't invade me from the external world, but at the time it felt totally real. If one were to analyze one's experience in this world, one would not finally find any difference. Perhaps the imprints that cause my dreams at night are somewhat weak, and so the dream imagery lasts only for a short time. But nevertheless, there is no hard difference between my experience now and that in the nighttime dreaming. And this is because what arises, according to the mind-only school, as objects and subjects, is actually caused by imprints. The imprints are impressions of previous experiences, previous actions, previous thoughts that create patterns in my mind, which, when the appropriate stimuli are present, cause these appearances to manifest. Our whole life is nothing more than this, according to the Chittamatra teaching. And in that, they're reflecting what Buddha said in the sutras, where he said, the whole three realms of existence is nothing more than mind. So for the Chittamatrians, the problem of duality, it's not there, because all is merely mental experience. Now we must be careful. To say all is mental experience could make it sound like this is a form of solipsism, that one is saying there's only my ego, only my mind. But in fact, not at all. There is no owner, there is no subject. If the images themselves, if the so-called objects lack validity, lack intrinsic nature, who is the owner of them? There isn't one. If there's no objects, there is no subject. If there's no other, there is no me. So Chittamatra means mind only, not my mind only. There is no my there whatsoever. Of course, I have the feeling that there is, but that is a matter of habit that I've built up through interpreting things from this dualistic framework, from, as we put it in Buddhism, from beginningless time. But just because one has a habit doesn't mean that habit conforms to reality. Just because one has a pattern of hallucination doesn't mean those hallucinations are real. Just because I've been misinterpreting experience for beginner's time doesn't make those misinterpretations any more real. So, to explain this in more detail, the Chittamatrians then, as it were, analyze the mind from as it is occurring from moment to moment, and show that underneath the patterns of sense consciousness that arise, so to speak, on the surface, there is the deeper levels of mind, which they call the seventh and eighth consciousnesses. The manas, the habit of egotism, which continues grasping any moment of experience and labeling it my experience. And the background of all that, those moments of mental experience, the alaya, the foundation, the kunji, the basis of all, which is the kind of, as it were, to use the analogy, the stream of mind is continuously changing. The sense experiences of mind arise on the surface like the ripples of on a river or on a stream. Beneath those ripples is the energy of the manas, that which is continuously grasping things and saying mine, and that itself arises on the basis of the, as it were, the depth of the stream, the alaya, where the imprints of past experience, past ripples, that have subsided but transmit an energy within the stream, will come forth as further experiences in the future. So this is the mind-only explanation of the nature of our experience. It is consistent with non-self and consistent with a non-dual experience of the world. It's very profound. And we can see the as it were, the evidence for this when we start to look into our mind from moment to moment from meditation. But still, we would argue, most Mahayanists, at least in the Tibetan traditions, would argue there's something still kind of philosophically not utterly coherent or still somewhat limited in the Chittamatra account of the world. And so the Madhyamaka school of the Madhyamaka system of tenets arose through such thinkers as Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, and then later on such thinkers as Chandrakirti and Shantideva, to, in a way, respond. Well, at least the later Madhyamaka thinkers were responding to the work of such Chittamatra thinkers as Asanga and Vasubandhu. And their name is kind of quite, in a way, significant. I mentioned right at the beginning of this that Buddha characterized his own stance, his own philosophical position, to extent you could say has a philosophical position, as the middle way, transcending extremes. The Madhyamaka thinkers too wanted in a way to reclaim that and restate that utter transcendence of all extremes as the characteristic of Buddhist thought. And they did so by looking back at the other philosophical systems, Vaibhashika, Sautrantrika, and later on the Chittamatra, and saying there's still a kind of, as it were, a deviation going on here. The deviation in the Vaibhashika and Sautrantrika is that through their notion that impermanence and non-self merely means things arise but pass away, but those things, whether atoms or moments of consciousness, are real, they are affirming a subtle type of existence. They're claiming things have a certain type of existence, albeit momentary. And that is, implicit in that is the eternalist view. It argues that some phenomena are truly existent, though momentary. And again, when the later Madhyamaka thinkers like Chandrakirti and Shantideva looked at the Chittamatra thought, however profound that is, however skillful it is in dissolving the dualism of the Vaibhashikas and Sautrantrikas, for Chandrakirti and Shantideva and so on, there is again a certain type of subtle eternalism in the mind only school, because they're saying that there is a phenomenon that is ultimately real, that does exist in itself, and it's the in itself bit that is the problem, philosophically speaking. What is it that the Chittamatrins argue exists in itself? It's mind, the basis of all, the kunji nampashepa, the base consciousness. I'd compare that to the bottom, the depth of the stream from which all the energy of the waves, in which they subside and from which they arise. The mind only are not theists. They're not arguing this is an eternal soul or a god or a Brahman or Atman or something like that, but they argue that in its moment of manifesting, it is real. So one moment of mind exists, ceases, and another moment of the mind arises. And that mind cannot be deconstructed. It is real and inherent in its moment of arising. But for the Madhyamakas, that violates the principle of dependent arising. All phenomena are merely manifesting like the reflection of the moon in the water, manifesting from the coming together of the satellite, water on the earth, cloudless sky, and viewer. The perception of a moon, the appearance of a moon is there, but the moon does not exist inherently, it cannot be found. Neither can any phenomena be found in itself. All is merely like that appearance, dependently arising appearance. So the mind as a basis of all is itself cannot be sustained, cannot be proved to be truly existent. Because after all, what the Chittamatrins are implicitly arguing is that all phenomena are unreal except mind, which is their basis. And how can phenomena which are unreal have a real basis? It's a violation of logic. It's a contradiction. That which does not really exist cannot have a real basis as its basis. So the mind that the Chittamatrins are, as it were, staking everything on as being the ultimate real, the ultimate basis, the ultimate bedrock of reality, itself is merely a dependently arising phenomenon. It's empty of its own nature. So the Chittamatrin system is wonderful up to a certain point, but then it too has to be deconstructed. Or else you're still subtly affirming something as real. And so what? Well, if you affirm anything as real, you've got a basis for clinging. You've got something to identify with. And as long as you're identifying with anything whatsoever, you have a position. And if you have a position, you're out of alignment with reality. Because the nature of reality, as Buddha pointed out, is it's free from all positions, cannot be conceptualized, cannot be put in any framework, into any holder, into any stance, into any position. That is the work of neurotic, conceptual, deluded mind. If one wants freedom, one must relax in that which is devoid of all such positions, of all such concepts, of all such names, of all such labels, even that of the mind only. So the Madhyamaka teaching The Madhyamaka view, in a way, is the ultimate deconstruction. Like Nagarjuna said, my view, my tawa, is that I don't have one. I'm free from all views. My mind rests on no position whatsoever. It's like totally de-intoxicated from all clinging to positions, to all clinging to phenomena. Because that clinging to positions, clinging to opinions, clinging to self, finally, is what is the cause of suffering. So in this way one can, and this has been a very kind of superficial presentation, of course, in one way one can see the four tenet systems as working out alongside, of course, because all this is based on practice, all this is based on meditation practice, on working out the full implications of Buddha's teaching of liberation, or to put it in philosophical terms, what is really the meaning of non-self, of emptiness. So there's much more, of course, one could say about the four tenet systems. There's masses we've missed out about Buddhist philosophy. We've not talked about pramana, logical reasoning through which we analyze the consistency of statements about phenomena. We've not talked about the distinction between conventional and ultimate truth. But all those are, such vast subjects. But I wanted at least to, as it were, tell a story about the tenet systems, which would make it clear that they are, for our liberation.